leadership. As Marcia already mentioned, I've held roles within diversity and inclusion for a number of decades now, really working with organizations to say, how do we create change when it comes to inclusive leadership? There's some research that myself and my team have conducted over the last 3 years, which have included over 3,000 leaders giving their views and perspectives around the world. And we've also engaged with a further 20,000 leaders for them to gauge their views and their perspectives around inclusive leadership and also what gets in the way. So I'm going to be sharing those views and perspectives with you during our time together. We will also have the opportunity to share our own views and perspectives with colleagues in this group, as well as share some of our views in the chat area as well. So please make sure that you're putting your questions in there, your views, your perspectives, as I take you through some of these reflections, because we will be touching on those throughout our time together. So let me jump into some views and perspectives around inclusive leadership. And what I'd like you to do, because I know we've got so many varied and different roles that we all play who are listening to this webinar. So let's think about, regardless if our role is as a coach or as a consultant or as a leader or as a mentor, whatever your role may be, I'd like you to think about some of these views and perspectives I'm sharing in the role that you have and how you can take some of this thinking to influence the work that you do. So if I jump in, first of all, to set the scene and to set some context around the conversation that we're going to have around inclusive leadership. There was a piece of research that was conducted by a man called Sudhanshu Palsal, who does a huge amount of work on the concept of rehumanizing leadership. And he's written a book around how you actually need to shift the thinking of a leader from not purely being about the task and getting the job done, but rehumanizing all of that thinking and really focusing on the people in our teams and those that we need to influence. Throughout that work, he found that there are a number of key challenges for leaders in the 21st century. And I want to briefly share these with you because I think these are important context for us to have. Now, the work that he completed was prior to the pandemic. And as he continued this work, he noticed that the pandemic and what we were all going through in very different guises around the world was really showing through in the research that he conducted. So let me share each of these different elements with you. The first element that he found that was absolutely significant was leaders need to be good at dealing with ambiguity. They need to be good at dealing with the unknown. So if we think about 12, 18 months ago, who would have known that the whole world would have been influenced by the COVID pandemic? But his view around this was things like this will constantly shift and change and challenge leaders to think about how are they going to deal with the unknown. So ambiguity is a really important point for leaders. The second one that he focused on was adaptability. So how do we shift and change our styles to enable us to get the best out of everyone and to get the best out of every single situation? I remember when I first started my career in banking a number of decades ago, there was a manager that told me that you know that you've been successful in your career when everybody else has to switch their style around you. Most recently, leaders have been saying to me that leadership is about how they switch their style to enable to get the best out of their people. So adaptability is absolutely key for leaders. And leaders get good at being more adaptable when they have different views of the world, different perspectives, and they're getting those insights from the people they work with. And we're going to touch on that in a little bit more detail shortly. The third challenge he identified for leaders in the 21st century is our attention. And what he means by that is where we spend our time and energy. Now, we all know we have a finite amount of time. There's always far more to do on the to-do list than the time we have available. But his focus was, how do we ensure as leaders we take the time and attention to our people? Because when we focus on our people, they ultimately focus on getting the task done, getting the job done. So his focus was very heavily around leaders need to be ambiguous, have to deal with ambiguity. They need to be agile. They need to be able to switch and change. They need that adaptability, and they get that from having very different views and perspectives of what's going on, but they need to be laser focused with their time and their energy. And that laser focus needs to be on their people, not purely on the task at hand. And this also flowed through in further work that's been done around the global people trends that we're seeing and how organizations respond to this. So let me share with you a few of these different perspectives, because this continually builds this requirement, this expectation of inclusive leadership, and actually what it is. So this was a piece of research that was conducted by Deloitte, and there's a few others that I will share with you as we go through over the next 5 or 10 minutes. But they were really focused on what are the things that are shifting around the world and in organizations that leaders need to take seriously. And these will naturally flow into how to be an inclusive leader. So I'm going to touch on a few of them now. Let me first of all focus on that family 2.0, that changing mix of people in work. And we know that this is different depending where we're based within the world. We know that cultures and society is different depending on where we're based. But some of the more common views that were happening around the world were linked to the fact that we're an aging world, and many of our cultures are aging populations. By 2035, 20% of the global population will be at the age of 65 or over. And that will have significant challenges for many organizations, for many countries, around how they support people that are deciding to retire. And if their countries have the pension capability there, how are they going to fund that? But organizations also having to think about, how do they manage and lead people when you may have up to 5 different generations in the workplace? Because that takes a different type of leader to be able to engage and lead somebody who may be in their 70 years of age compared to somebody who may be in their early 20s. So how do we have that adaptability as leaders? How do we have that adaptability as organizations? Within Family 2.0 as well, it's that increased shift around who takes responsibility for childcare, who takes responsibility for elder care. And when families are having those conversations, how then are organizations and companies reflecting that in what they offer to their people around their policies, their processes, who is enabled to have paternity leave, what do they give on maternity leave, and also how do they support people that have elder care responsibilities. So these shifts in society are meaning we're needing to shift in organizations around how we do things differently. If I look right to the other side of the screen, you'll see that element around always on, and the technology is transforming how we work. Now, I think the last 12 to 18 months have significantly transformed how many people work around the world. And I remember speaking to many organizations who would quite happily tell me that there was never an opportunity that people could work from home. That would never happen. The technology wasn't ready. Their culture wasn't ready. But so many companies around the world literally had to do that within weeks last year as the pandemic was going across our world. Now, we appreciate that many roles cannot be done remotely. Many roles cannot be done from home, but those that were able to, that technology was available and organizations shifted very, very quickly. Who knows what's going to happen over the coming months and the coming years around how that changes the way we work long term. But what we do know is technology has given us that ability, and it's proven that it works in many, many examples. Organizations are also looking at what are the roles and what are the tasks that machines can do versus people. and what are the roles and the tasks that only human beings can do. So this is constantly shifting, this dynamic about who does what within the workplace and the role that technology plays. The final element I want to highlight here is this social conscience element. And we're seeing this increasingly, that people are expecting their organizations and their leaders to take social justice, elements such as corporate responsibility, hugely seriously. There was a recent piece of research that showed that people that were defined as Generation Z, so those just starting to come into the workplace, were expecting organizations to take social injustice and corporate responsibility seriously, and they wanted to know what the organizations were doing. And if we look across some different countries around the world and the increased conversations in the last 12 months around racism, for example, increasingly we're seeing people expecting their employers and expecting the companies that they spend their money with to do something about it. Now, these are global people trends that are only going to ever continue. And what's important for leaders to consider is the key skills that inclusive leadership give you to be able to respond to these, to have that agility, to be able to do something differently, but also knowing, linking back to my previous comments, that ambiguity plays an important part here too. So let me share a few data points to really bring this home for us and think about what's the role of inclusive leadership and what's the part that we play. So again, recent piece of research by Deloitte showed that organizations that create and manage an inclusive culture are 3 times as likely to be high performing, 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile, 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. This is research that has been done time and time again, and it shows that when organizations are more inclusive and they lead in that way, it has better business outcomes. We also know that inclusive leaders play an important part in this. And as you can see there, inclusive leaders lead to a 70% increase in feelings of fairness, respect, and value within their teams and within the organization. And by being an inclusive leader, which is about switching and changing our behaviors and our style just a little bit, it showed that 17%, there's a 17% increase in team performance, 20% increase in decision-making quality, and a 29% increase in team collaboration. So when teams and organizations have inclusive leaders, this significantly increases those perspectives of fairness, respect, and value, something that I know as human beings, we all expect. And then if we look at this from an employee point of view, so we've looked at this from a culture, from a leader, and then an employee. We're increasingly expecting this from our leaders, regardless of who they might be. And wherever we work, we're expecting that to be much more inclusive. So again, in that piece of research, they found that 72% of people said they would leave an organization for a more inclusive one. So when companies are so focused on getting the best talent into their organizations, sometimes it's forgotten about who they're actually losing. But 72% of people said they'd leave an organization for a more inclusive one. 30% of millennials, so that generation that are just coming up to the age of 40 in organizations and below, were saying they'd already left a company, they'd already left a job to go to a more inclusive area or a more inclusive company. But the important aspect for us to reflect on is a third of people, so 33% of people said, I do not feel comfortable being myself at work, don't feel comfortable speaking up, don't feel comfortable expressing opinion. And I think this is an important aspect to reflect on, because leaders have that ability to tap into this. And when this is untapped, this has a significant impact. So if we take this information, it's potentially telling us that across the organizations around the world, that a third of the brain power, a third of the insights that we could be tapping into, we're just not getting. And that's an important aspect for many, many organizations and for many, many leaders to reflect on. So all of that leads me to this question for for organizations and for leaders, regardless of our role, whether we're a coach, a mentor, a leader, or a consultant, is the what's our why? What is your why as to why inclusive leadership is so important? What's the why for organizations, as we've seen in some of those data points, as to why they should really take this seriously? What's the why for us as leaders in the roles that we play, regardless of the organizations that we're in? So I'm just going to pause there for 1 second, but I'd love to get, if there's any reflections or any questions linked to what I've shared so far. And it'd be also great to hear a few perspectives around what's your why around the importance of inclusive leadership. So
Charlotte, yeah, there is a question about the author that you mentioned in the first slide. We couldn't get the name, and there is somebody asking if you can repeat.
So the name of the author is Sudhanshu Palsul, and I'm very happy to put the link into chat a little bit later. And his book is called Rehumanizing Leadership. And he works in many different educating organizations, such as Cambridge, for example. So his book is Rehumanizing Leadership.
Great, thank you.
I'd love to see if there's any reflections on what's your why around the importance of inclusive leadership before I move on.
There is a question: which organizations are making a difference? Some research indicates that most UK organizations have D&I policies, but only 25% of people say it's making a difference. What are your thoughts? And her why: everyone deserves a chance.
I love that why. Everybody does deserve a chance. And linking to that comment around, and it'd be great to get a sense of the source of the research that you're referring to. You are absolutely right that many organizations in the UK, in the US, and in other countries as well, do have diversity and inclusion policies. And many think that it's not making a difference. This is the critical aspect, and this is a critical aspect I'm going to touch on as we go through our time together as well. There is one thing having a policy, there is something very different bringing it to life and being very serious and intentional about the activity you do to really make that difference. I notice in the work that I do as a consultant that many organizations say they want to create a more diverse and a more inclusive workplace. And then when they actually realize some of the activity that they will have to do, some of the decisions they need to make, some of the things they need to do differently, they're not as keen or committed to wanting to make that change happen. So I think there's a very important point here for leaders and organizations to be very, very clear about what it means to be more diverse and to be more inclusive, and actually what they would have to do differently as a result.
Okay, some more whys: different cultural, different perspective. Another one: we deserve to live in a world where everyone has a seat at the table. One more: ensure space for different mindsets that lead to different ideas and innovation. Mm-hmm. There is a reflection here. Just a second. People are choosing where they want to work. Here in my state, my province, we have suffered from lack of talents in companies, and they have a lot of market potential, but they don't manage to move forward because of lack of people and the required competencies. If they were more inclusive, they would be more attractive. More whys. My whys: work is one part of life. Well-being has to be part of the business. Other one, there is creative genius in the collective wisdom of a system. When all voices are heard, teams and organizations can truly be innovative and revolutionary.
Thank you, Marcia, for sharing some of those. And these are great examples of why, and it's being really clear about what is our why on why we do this and why it's so important. And I love that comment around the organization that's challenged in getting talent into their organizations, because many leaders who may not be as focused on creating a more inclusive workplace and may see this as something that is a little bit, as we call it, fluffy or nice to have, don't really appreciate the impact it has on the ability of being able to attract and retain the best talent to really support your organization. So these are really important aspects for us to reflect on. And these are things that we're going to be looking at in a little bit more detail as we go through the rest of our time together today. So let me move on, because I know there's a question on here as well around do different generations of employees view inclusivity differently? There are some aspects around that I will touch on a little bit later, but I'd also love to get your insights on that as we go through some of the further insights over the next hour. So let me jump on to the next area of this, because something for us to reflect on. And I'm sure you all know in the work that you do that many organizations, many leaders are constantly talking around the aspects around bias and unconscious bias and the impact it has on our worldview. I don't necessarily want to jump into that in great detail, and I also don't necessarily fundamentally agree that unconscious bias is the only thing that we should be focusing on when we're looking at diversity, but also inclusive leadership. But it's an important aspect to be aware of, and it's an important lens to look at this through, because we all know that our view of the world, our experiences, how we've been brought up, how we've been educated, the organizations or companies we may have worked at, the additional studying we may have done, the influences of our friends and those we spend a lot of time with, even down to the influences from the social media that we watch and follow, the news information that we decide to download, the information that we get around the world and the different channels that we go into, they influence our view of the world. And I'm very conscious of that from my point of view as well, knowing that how I was brought up, the education I had, the countries I've lived in have influenced my view and my perspective of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, what's inclusive and what's not inclusive. But we all need to be aware of that, and we all need to be very clear about the worldview that we have, and also how that drives us, how that influences the decisions we make, the assumptions we make around people, and also the behaviors we display. Sometimes that can get a little bit lost in organizations. Sometimes that can get a little bit lost with leaders when they're thinking about different views and perspectives and also the decisions they make. So we're going to have a little bit of fun with this before I move into inclusion as a mindset and what are the things that we need to be thinking about as leaders. So first of all, I'm going to share with you this photograph. And I would love some comments in the chat area about who is this man. As soon as you see this photograph, what's the assumption or what's the thinking that you're jumping to? Because we all have a brilliant ability to do this. As soon as we see something or hear something, we're already jumping to assumptions and conclusions. We're already wanting to fill the lack of information in with some of the experiences that we've had previously. So I'd love to get a few comments in the chat area about who's this man? When you look at this picture, what do you automatically think? I love that first one, a well-off Anglo-Saxon. Thank you. So we've got a guy, I'll pick some of the English versions up, and Marcia, if I can ask you to pick the Portuguese. A guy watching TV, a successful man, friendly and warm, easygoing, enjoys life. He looks
great
like okay.
leader.
Sorry, say that again, Marcia.
A great leader.
Brilliant, thank you. A simple man watching TV. Any others? Yeah, absolutely right. We're only seeing part of him, part of the person. Question if he's sick, happy with himself.
Successful entrepreneur.
CEO who feels very comfortable in his role. Somebody who's happy, got good memories. So as you can see here, we all do this, don't we? Even though people say they don't, we all do this in some shape or form. As soon as we see a picture, we see a visual, we hear something, we meet somebody for the first time, we can jump to assumptions and conclusions or our own view about who this person is. And I think this is an important aspect for us to reflect on. And let me tell you who this man is. And I'll be really, really honest with you. I've got absolutely no idea. I've got no idea who this man is in any shape or form, but we focus on that person and we focus on some views and perspectives we may have. And this was a piece of research that was conducted by Canon in Australia, because they wanted to understand the impact that our associations and assumptions had on how we frame somebody. And what I mean by that is how we then talk about somebody and then how we influence other people's judgments and assumptions of someone. So the research was conducted where the researcher got 6 different photographers, and individually he spoke to them about the person you are going to take a photograph of is. And he shared a little bit about the gentleman's background, around the role that they did, a little bit about their life. And each story was very, very different. And he wanted to test, if I'm sharing these stories about this person, will that influence how the photographer sees the person and therefore how they treat him and how they photograph him? So effectively, how he was priming them and positioning a view about the individual. I'm going to share with you those 6 photographs. And as you can see, they all look very, very different. So the photographers were given 6 different stories. As you can see, the picture with the psychic, where they have that chair in the background that nobody seems to be sitting on, or are they? That picture of the ex-convict and how that photograph looks very different to the one of the self-made millionaire. Or how about the one of the alcoholic, and what you can't see too well at the bottom is a bottle of water at the bottom just stood by the side of them. That looks very different to the picture of the lifesaver. And the reason I'm sharing this with you, in the roles that we play, be that a coach, a mentor, a leader, whoever that may be, we have a significant level of influence and power around how we can frame the perceptions of other people. And by sharing some views, some perspectives, we can significantly influence the experience that somebody else has of other human beings. This is really important for us to reflect on as leaders, really important for us to reflect on when it comes to inclusive leadership. And this really follows on to this next bit around what are the actions of inclusive leaders, around how do we use that power, how do we use that influence appropriately to ensure that we're not creating misjudgments, my apologies, or misviews of people that we're influencing, we're leading, we're coaching, we're consulting with, we're mentoring. So let me take you through the key elements around shifting inclusion into a mindset and those actions of an inclusive leader. And what I'd love you to do as you're reflecting on these is think about, how do they influence the work that I do, regardless of what that may be? And how much do I honestly and actively deliver the actions of inclusive leadership? So let me take you through each one. And this is work that's been conducted in a number of organizations around what are the actions and behaviors that inclusive leaders do that really make a difference. So let me share these with you, and then I'd love some reflections and thoughts. The first one is around giving and receiving feedback, knowing that none of us are the final product. None of us are the finished product, but by getting feedback on our words and our actions and our impact really shifts things. And also making sure that we give feedback to others as well. Now, the work that I do with leaders, many tell me that they get feedback on tasks, on the actions they do. Very few actually focus on getting feedback around their behaviors and the impact they have on others, which is a really important aspect to reflect on. The second one is around developing self-awareness, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit more in some of the further research that we've done. But this is about understanding that worldview. If you think about that slide that I shared with the circles in it, it's understanding that. It's developing our own awareness of why do we think in the way that we do? Why do we make the assumptions that we make? Why do we frame comments around people in the different ways that we do? The third one is around building diversity within our networks. So are the people that we regularly go to for views, perspectives, and insights the same as us, similar to us, or very different to us? And that goes to that research that I mentioned around Sudhanshu and rehumanizing leadership, when he talks about that element of adaptability, and getting diverse views and perspectives is critical to be able to adapt. And building our network, building our perspectives are absolutely key. The next one is around shaping and delivering with colleagues. So this is about being truly collaborative, knowing that we all don't have the answers, but knowing by working together and collaborating, we'll absolutely get a best result or a best response. And that links to that next point just above it, around seeking multiple points of views. So making sure we're getting those diverse views and perspectives, rather than either assuming that many people think the same or ignoring those that think very differently to us. Something else that inclusive leaders do, which is really important and increasingly important in our worlds where we're not seeing each other as much physically, but we're constantly seeing each other on a screen. And this is this communicating inclusively. In so many organizations I've worked in, there's been very clear issues around how leaders communicate, how they ensure that they're communicating to people that may be extroverts or people that may be introverts, how they're ensuring that their communication is accessible for people with different disabilities, how they're communicating to a group of people where there are numerous preferred languages, and making sure that message gets across consistently. So communication and being inclusive within that is absolutely key. The next one I want to just touch on is this, this area about being transparent. And this is a critical aspect for inclusive leaders. It's not about hiding information, but it's being as open and transparent as possible about what's happening and why it's happening. Opening those areas of conversation up for people to be able to talk about that, not hiding information in any way, because as soon as we hide information or choose not to share it, many people are trying to understand, so what's missing and why is it missing? And generally we make our own stories up. So inclusive leaders are more transparent around what's happening and why it's happening. The next one I want to focus on is making it safe for others. So this is about, it links to psychological safety. And I'm sure many of us have done work in the past or thought about psychological safety, and that comfort and that safety to be able to speak up and know that it will not have a detrimental impact on you because you've done it. Inclusive leaders really make sure they make it safe for others. They really ensure that people have that opportunity to speak up and to speak out. And there's a recent piece of work that's been done by a man called Dr. Tim Clark within the US. He focuses on the different levels of psychological safety. And he talks about the fact of psychological safety is where you can have intellectual friction, where you can challenge views and perspectives without having social friction. So you can challenge somebody's views and perspectives without challenging them as an individual. And that's the essence of making it safe for others to speak up. And the final point I'll highlight, and this goes back to that point around attention and time, is that pressing pause at relevant times, knowing that when we're under stress, knowing when we don't have enough time, knowing when we have a to-do list that's too long for the time that we have available, it is easy to jump to conclusions and assumptions and not get the different insights and views and perspectives from others. So making sure we press pause now and again to make sure we're reflecting on what we're doing and how we're doing it, making sure we're getting that feedback from others, making sure we're getting those different views and perspectives from others, checking in to make sure people understand why we're doing what we're doing and the next steps around it, making sure we're making it safe for others to be able to speak up and to speak out. So those are the consistent actions and behaviors and skill sets and mindsets that are really important for inclusive leaders to truly step into being a more inclusive leader with their people, regardless of who they may be. So I'm going to pause there because I'd love to get some reactions or some reflections around some of those aspects you've seen on there so far. So please feel free to put your comments in chat. And I know Marcia will also support me in the translation.
There were a couple of questions that were in the back, so I'm going to start with them, okay?
Excellent.
Do you think this shift is possible without starting with a deep self-revision, rediscovering? What would be, in your experience, the best way to bring this need to traditional leaders' attention?
So I think that's a really, really good question. And I'm going to link it to a comment that was made earlier about that perception or that data point around organizations. It was mentioned for the UK that has policy around D&I, but it doesn't have the impact. This is the reason why so much of this doesn't have that significant impact, is that in my experience, many leaders do not take the time to increase and develop their own self-awareness. And I'm sure many of us have experienced when leaders have said, just tell me what to do. When it comes to creating a more diverse and more inclusive workplace and thinking about our style and how we come across to people within our teams, it cannot be sustainable by somebody saying, just tell me what to do. There are elements of this where we really have to understand what's driving our thought process, what's driving the behaviors that we display day in, day out, and what, if anything, needs to change as a result of that. So that self-awareness is really, really important. Otherwise, this becomes nothing more than a tick box and something that is not a sustainable action. And I just want to highlight, Jose, you mentioned around useful for us as coaches. This is a really important aspect for us to reflect on. I'm thinking about my practice as a coach. These are all the disciplines that I really focus on for the role that I play as a coach, and also being aware of my world experience, my worldview, and how that influences what I pick up from my coachees, what I dive into, and what I ask more questions about. So I think these are really important reflection points for us as coaches.
Great. There is a comment here, just a second. There is an expression that translates the behavior in the companies related to inclusion and diversity, which is called be invited to the party and not be invited to dance. So when they hire people, they only are following the quotas, but they are not including, in fact.
And I think that's a really good point. And the quote that you mentioned around diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. I mean, that's a well-used quote by Verna that was created by Verna Myers when she has been focusing on this work. And I think she currently works at Netflix as their head of inclusion and diversity. And this is an important point because many organizations will focus on, we want to get more diverse talent into the organization. But when they don't focus on inclusion, it means you have all of that untapped knowledge and insight sat in your organization without being able to access it. If you remember that 33% figure I shared right at the very beginning, about 33% of people feeling that they're unable to be themselves and speak up. That is a great example of what happens in an organization where they focus on bringing diverse talent in, but not focusing on creating that environment where they can speak up and where people feel that they can be themselves and contribute to their best. So I think that's a really great and important point.
A question also, again, about the generations. So which generation has the strongest, already embodied the inclusion matter issue?
So I think it's a really good question. I wouldn't want to, personally, I wouldn't want to stereotype to say there is a particular gender that's, a generation that's better than another at some of these elements or are more advanced in this. I go back to that point around our worldview and our own experiences. Regardless of our age, our world experiences have influenced how we are as leaders, how we are as coaches. And so first of all, that's why that developing that self-awareness is so important. I've seen some great and many great inclusive leaders at lots of different ages. And I've also seen people who are very exclusionary at lots of different ages as well. I think the critical bit here is understanding our own worldview and our own experiences, spending some time looking at that, developing our self-awareness and what influences us, and then focusing on the other elements around how we can change those. I think linking to the comment made in chat, and then I'll move on to the next bit because I want to get you to get a bit of time together. If we're going to start to practice this inclusion mindset, where and how can we start out from these 9 boxes? My encouragement, and this feeds into another comment I'm going to make in a second, is really, if you haven't already done so, focus on that self-awareness first. So your styles, your leadership style, those different elements, and then just focus on one other. It doesn't really matter where you start, but commit to focusing on one other, honing that, fine-tuning that, getting your feedback around that, and then move to the next. So this isn't around doing each one in a particular order, but where you think you may need some more support versus the ones that you may be already really good at. So let me move on, because I've shared with you what they are. I also want to share with you what stops it. And this is, as I mentioned right at the very beginning of our time together, I mentioned a piece of research that myself and my organization have done over the last 3 years. And we call it Leaders First. And it links directly to these different elements of inclusion as a mindset. So over the last 3 years, we've interviewed over 3,000 leaders from around the world, different sectors, different size of organizations, different countries, different professions. And we've asked the question, when organizations are so passionate and so focused on creating a more diverse and more inclusive workplace, what is it that stops it happening? So if chief executives and senior leaders are so passionate about it and think it's so important, why doesn't it happen? And it goes to that point that was in the chat area earlier around many people not feeling that the diversity and inclusion policies within their organizations were coming to life. So we pulled the findings together of that piece of research, and we've also tested it with 20,000 other leaders around the world. And the views are consistent. So let me share with you the 5 consistent themes about why this doesn't progress. and why inclusive leadership doesn't progress. So the first one is fear, and this links to that developing self-awareness element as well. So many leaders were telling us that they have a fear of saying or doing something wrong that could cause embarrassment, pain or harm to either themselves or someone else. So using the wrong terminology, saying something that may be inappropriate that they were not aware of, doing something that was taken in the wrong way by somebody else. So this element around our intention versus our impact. So many leaders, regardless of level, were saying, I'm fearful of doing or saying something wrong, so it's easier not to. The second one was ignorance, and this absolutely does link into that, developing our self-awareness, but also our own view of the world. And this was an element that leaders were saying that they had a lack of knowledge or understanding around other people's life experiences, their views, their backgrounds, or how they have to navigate this world. So not really understanding how others have to navigate this world or how they have to do things differently. And it was that level of ignorance of not really understanding that and then not having that in their worldview or their perceptions whatsoever. The third one was around relinquishing responsibility. So leaders saying this is really important, but then not actually doing anything about it. So saying it's really important, but I'll let somebody else do it and they can give me an update in 6 months' time. And this is where leaders were not seeing that they play an important and significant role in their behaviors, how they talk about this and how they treat other people as well. And as coaches, as consultants, as mentors, we have an important role to play here of holding that mirror up to leaders around the responsibility they have in doing this day in, day out. The fourth one was what we call systemic inertia. Let me tell you a little bit more about that. This is about organizations saying this isn't working. We don't have the right policies and practices and processes, and yet doing nothing about it. So saying we need to hire more diverse talent as an example, but then not changing how they recruit, not thinking about how they look out there for more diverse talent, not changing anything. And this was as if it was the hope that even though they don't do anything different, they may get a different result. But we all know that that just doesn't happen. So systemic inertia was saying it needs to change, but they weren't changing anything. And then the final one that came up is time. People saying we don't have enough time to do this. And it links back to that comment I made right at the very beginning around attention. So I haven't got the time to do this. There are more pressing agenda items for me, more pressing areas to focus on. But what this was also saying was that leaders saw the work on inclusion or being an inclusive leader as something in addition to what they do as a leader. So they were not seeing it as part of the day job. They were not seeing it as part of their role. They saw it as something in addition to what they should do. So if we think about those different elements around inclusion as a mindset and what should happen to create a more inclusive workplace and be a more inclusive leader and be a more inclusive coach and mentor, this shows us what stops that from happening. It's not challenging the everyday habits that we have around the behaviors that we display and what we do. It's not acknowledging that fear that we may have around, am I using the right terminology? Am I going to say something wrong that may offend? How do I respond to that if I do? And it's having that level of ignorance of not understanding other people's worldviews, not having that capability to ask the right questions and influence and think about the responses that other people may give us. And this is the point now where I'm going to pause, because I'd love to get you to have the opportunity to reflect on this in smaller groups. And I'm going to share some perspectives around how we're going to do that. And then I'm going to hand over to Camilla to enable us to make that happen. So it's a brief conversation in some smaller groups. And here's what I would love you to have the opportunity to do. And we'll do it roughly for 10 minutes, because I'd love to take the opportunity to get a few insights when you come back. So I want to reflect on what's getting in the way. So those 5 different areas I've just shared with you about what leaders were telling us gets in the way of doing this. I'd love your reflections on what is the biggest barrier for you Is it fear? Is it ignorance? Is it those elements of not seeing this as my responsibility or not changing what I do? So that's systemic inertia. Or is it I just don't have time to do this and I don't see how this feeds into what I need to do each and every day? So I'd love you to have that conversation about what is your biggest barrier. And I'd also like you to reflect on how can the inclusive actions help you overcome those barriers. So if we think about that inclusion mindset, that getting feedback, those elements of being transparent, pressing pause, getting different people's views and opinions, how could those influence you and help you to overcome the barrier you may have when it comes to inclusive leadership? So as you can see there, it says that we've got 10 minutes to have those conversations, and that will happen as soon as you get into those smaller breakout rooms. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Camilla, who is going to take us through the logistics of making that happen.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, let's just some ground rules here and on how we are going to operate the breakout rooms. Let me just putting off my translation here, otherwise I can hear me. I get crazy because I'm speaking English and listening Portuguese. So yeah, it's off now. And just to clarify, the only way we can get translation, interpretation is if we are here in the main room. So we're going to assign you all to breakout rooms. As we can see, we have mostly Portuguese speakers here. So if you are in a group that's speaking Portuguese mostly, you can just come back to the main room because we can make it in English, the main room, okay? So just click join, come back to the main room, and we figure out how we can help you to be in a group with English speakers, okay? So let's go, we have 10 minutes. Hope you enjoy your time chatting together because exchanging is very important for us too. So let's go.
Alguma coisa aconteceu que eu não fui para a sala. Você pode me mandar?
Ronald, eu vou te mandar para uma sala. Tô te mandando
pode mandar em inglês, tanto faz. Pode ser
tanto
inglês.
Faz.
Pode ser português, o que você quiser.
All right. Anybody else? I think everybody, because maybe people that join after I made the breakouts are here. So
Camila,
yeah.
can you please send Tatiana to another Portuguese speaking group?
Yeah, I will.
May I speak?
Kristen.
I came back. My Portuguese is pretty bad, so I had to come back, but that's okay. So we just see what will happen. I don't mind.
All right, you can put your mics on and just starting to exchange. If you are an English speaker, we're gonna do this in English, okay? Here in the main room. And
I'm an English speaker. I joined a bit late, so if you can give me one of the breakout rooms, that would be good.
we're gonna make it here with English speakers. Since we are already here, we can start the reflections and exchange. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Okay. So we can start exchanging a little bit our views. Yeah, I overall I found this very interesting. I like what she's saying. I am also business coach and a very international, lived in many countries, and you know I see diversity and inclusive leadership. This is a dream, and I've seen a lot of barriers from many leaders.
Because I know we've got a few people that are hiding somewhere in virtual corridors and different things like that, which is always the joy of Zoom, isn't it? It's not by the coffee machine anymore. It's whether our Wi-Fi enables us to come back or not. So great to see you all back. And I would love to just get one or two reflections or thoughts around the comments, the conversation that you had in your smaller groups. So just one or two thoughts, either please put them in the chat area, or we may have the opportunity to unmute if people put their hands up and enable Marcia to know who wants to speak. I'll jump in as I can see, Patricia, you've mentioned a comment in chat around fear. And I think when you look at those different elements within those 5 areas, fear and ignorance work together very closely, because the more you reduce your ignorance, there's that opportunity to reduce your fear as well, because we're generally fearful of what we don't know. So raising our awareness and our perspectives helps to reduce that fear. The other ones are more focused around the actions, around taking responsibility, doing something different, finding the time and enabling the time to make it happen. Lauren, you've put happy to speak. If you're happy to unmute.
Hi there. Yes, of course I am. Thank you, Charlotte. Really enjoying the session today. So in my group was Maria and Juliana, and we had a really good conversation about, actually it links to what you talked about there in terms of fear. And what we found is that actually linked into the action that you then spoke about. And Juliana put it brilliantly, actually. She said that if we use COVID as an opportunity, as a step change, because COVID in itself hasn't discriminated, it's touched all of our lives in immeasurable ways, really. If we'd have thought 18 months ago we would be all working from home and in different environments with, you know, loved ones lost or unwell, we would never have imagined it. So we can use that, you know, in a very coaching way as a solution, focused mind frame, a positive mind frame to drive some of the action that we're wanting to see, and have that as a bit of a springboard, really, to move from having conversations in a closed meeting that don't make any changes to become the changes that we're wanting to see.
Brilliant, Lauren, thank you. And I think they're really, really important points. And also this opportunity that the current environment has given us to think about how we can do things differently. And I hear so many leaders say, when we get back to normal, and I just love people to stop saying when we get back to normal, because it's about how do we take this opportunity now to do something a little bit different? What is it from previously we wanted to keep? And what is it from now, how we've been operating and how we've been doing things differently that we want to keep as well? And how we can learn from all of that, I think, is really, really important. I'm just looking on the chat area. Victor, you've mentioned a comment about people ask for feedback but don't like the answer. I think there is an element of when we ask for feedback, and I know this is different across different cultures, but if we're truly asking for feedback, we need to be comfortable with the feedback that we get, or be prepared to do something with the feedback we get, regardless of what it may be. I had one of my bosses many, many years ago used to say to me, feedback is a gift that you don't have to open. So people may want to give it to you, but you don't have to take any notice of it. I challenge around those elements around ignorance and us wanting to be more inclusive leaders. We need to listen to the feedback and then choose what we may do with that afterwards. I love these points around ignorance and giving the opportunity to learn. I think it's important to highlight that none of us know everything there is to know around diversity and inclusion. We all come with different worldviews and different perspectives. And that element of that willingness to listen and learn are absolutely crucial for all of us. And that point around relinquishing responsibility, leave it to somebody else to do, as it's not my problem. I hear that so many times. And I think the important bit for each of us, because this is such a broad topic, the important aspect for each of us in our roles is, what's the one action I can do consistently that will make a difference? What's the one habit I can create that will make a difference in the work that I do? And then gradually build from that rather than trying to change everything all at once. So I'll just pause to see if there's any other comments or areas that people would like to share on that. Before I move on, I've got one final reflection, and then we've got plenty of time for questions, comments, reflections as well. Let me move to my final reflection point. And I think as the role that we do, and I was listening to some of the other comments around this, the role that we do as coaches, as consultants, it's really important for us to reflect on this final point. And then I'll pause so that we've got time for any further conversation, any questions, any reflections on this. And I'm sure we've all seen this quote from Stephen Covey, and I'm sure many of us may have used it ourselves in the past, but it's an important reflection and reminder when we're looking at the work around inclusion and we look at diversity. All of us see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we've been conditioned to see it. And I think it's an important reflection for all of us around what are those points that we've been conditioned to see in the past, be that around leadership, be that around organizations and their culture. But what is it we've been conditioned to see or conditioned to do? And what is it that we need to do differently to ensure that we're acting inclusively ourselves? We're thinking about getting those diverse views and opinions, and we're making sure that we bring this to life to our people. Whether we're a leader, whether we're a coach, whether we're a consultant, that we're challenging those aspects that we have been conditioned to see, and how we can challenge and think about those a little bit differently. So I'll press pause now. I'm going to hand over to Marcia, because I know, Marcia, you're going to do a brilliant job at supporting me with any of the comments, the questions, the reflections that either come through the chat area, or if people unmute and share a perspective as well. So thank you in advance for that, Marcia.
Sure. So there are some comments that were discussed in the groups. Some leaders think that it's not fear for real, it's only a new wave. There are initiatives very interesting, but it's challenging and difficult. There is a lot of barriers. Other one, as much as we have a different mentality, we will always be ignorant from the perspective of some educating, of some others. Educating is always important. Our group was very diverse. We had people from UK, Thailand, Iran, and Brazil. We agreed that ignorance is the main problem. Not being aware of the impact of D&I can bring for results. I think that's it.
I think there are some great points there, and I know another one has just sprung up, so I'll look at that in a second, but I just want to highlight some of these points around some of these different elements. And I know, and Jose, you've mentioned here about their initiatives, very interesting, but it's challenging and difficult as well. I think this is one of the interesting challenges around some of these aspects around inclusive leadership and diversity, because many organizations talk about it, and I'm sure you've heard it in the work you do, around D&I being an initiative. Now, for me, an initiative means that it's something that starts and stops. There's a start point to it and there's an end point to it as well. And actually for organizations to bring, as as was mentioned earlier, about bringing the policies around diversity and inclusion to life. So really making sure that what we say we do, we do. This is about changing our culture. This is not about an initiative that will start at some point and end at some other point. This is about how we embed this into what we do as an organization and what we do as leaders. And where some organizations fail is where they talk about initiatives, but they then do not take the learning from the initiative and then build that back into their business and build that back into their culture. And much more work needs to be done in organizations around that as well. I'll link onto this point that was mentioned around whilst senior leaders may say the right thing and genuinely want to change, lower leaders and managers will find it hard as they are operational and busy. And how can we best support them? I think that's a really great comment, a really great question. I see many senior leaders that really do want to change. And they do want to see the change. This goes back to that systemic inertia element. They're then not creating the environment or the priorities for the middle managers or more junior managers and leaders to be able to change their behaviors, their habits, or what's important for the organization. So for many companies that say they truly want to change, they need to look at what they do differently. And then how we enable leaders and managers, regardless of level across the organization, to do that differently as well. That's really, really important.
One more comment, it's about the cultural aspects of the organization. And one more, we perceived in our group that we need to move from ignorance, talk about it, have dialogues, more genuine dialogues, and so each one can express their vulnerability. We need to be open to be educated about inclusion. We need to show to companies what they gain changing this mentality, this mindset.
Great points. And just linking into that, what was a jump into my mind? I was thinking as a coach at that point, when I've heard many of the leaders and executives that I coach say to me two things. One I've already mentioned, just tell me what to do, which we know will not create long-term change. The second one is less talk, more action, is what I hear from leaders a lot. And when I've unpicked that in the conversations we've had, there's been a couple of things that have come out from that. First of all, that lack of awareness that the more talk, the more awareness, the reduction of ignorance, it enables us to do something different as a result. I think that's an important point. The other point that I see in some leaders is that fear of what might happen as a consequence of the more talk, as in, will I have to shift my thinking? Will I be exposed to some thinking that I'm either uncomfortable with, not aware of, don't know what to say, how to say it? So I think there's a really important balance for us to think about in the roles that we do. In more talk enables us to reduce ignorance and increase that self-awareness, but that also should also be then focused on. So as a result of that awareness and that reduction of ignorance, what am I going to do differently? And then how am I going to convert that into action? So whenever leaders say to us, less talk, more action, I'd always encourage lots of talk and a lot of action as well, because that's where we reduce their ignorance.
Great. So one more comment. In our group, the main conclusion was to do a work of constant awareness.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we've all seen this, haven't we, in organizations where they take everybody through diversity and inclusion training once and then say it's done, it's all sorted. Or some of the criticisms we've had in the UK and in some other countries around companies focusing on things such as unconscious bias training and then saying it's done. And my response to companies is you cannot unpick 30, 40, 50 years of conditioning in one 20-minute online learning program. And don't even think for 1 minute that you can. And we all know this, don't we, in the roles that we do as professionals. But that's about how we really challenge what really goes on in organizations to create this change. And going to that final point on here, role modeling is vital for change. Absolutely right. For people to see us in our professional standing and our roles, role modeling what's expected of inclusive leaders, encouraging the people that we work with, who we coach, who we consult with, to ensure they're doing the same, and the senior leaders in the organizations doing the same, is hugely powerful, and that will help create that change.
Thank you, Charlotte, for the amazing presentation, sharing your findings with us. I'm going to do the closing, okay? I'm sure everyone appreciated your presence here with us. Vou falar em português agora. Então, muito obrigada, Charlotte, e a todos os participantes. Lembrem-se de garantir seu certificado de participação e CCUs, preenchendo o formulário que está no chat. Acesse o Instagram da ICF Brasil, @icf.brasil, e se inscreva em nossos eventos da semana, que a Camila está colocando aí no chat. O nosso próximo evento será hoje às 14 horas, com o Dave Snowden, e mais às 17 e, de novo, outro evento às 19 horas. Então, fique à vontade para se inscrever. Muito obrigada pela presença de vocês. A gente vai ficar aqui um pouquinho, se alguém tiver mais uma pergunta para fazer. Obrigada, espero revê-los em breve.